Hello, I'm the Dark Master. In today's video, we shall be doing something rather special. Seeing as how I've been reviewing the Kirby Right Back At Ya anime, I figure I ought to, at some point, start talking about the Kirby games. No, I'm not reviewing them yet. That's for later. I still got some things I gotta work out. But I thought perhaps it might be cool for this Christmas season to discuss the series' big bad, King Dedede. For full transparency, this episode was partially inspired by Villainous Warlord's videos, where he ranked Donkey Kong bosses, though the idea itself was in my head a few years before he made his channel, so don't throw the word plagiarism at me. In all seriousness, if you like video game content, I highly recommend you go subscribe to him. I am subscribed to him, and he's almost to 1,000 subs. I'm sure you guys can push him over that important milestone. Back on topic, King Dedede, or some variant thereof, has appeared as a boss in nearly every Kirby game, serving as a rival to the pink protagonist, with the exceptions of Kirby in the Amazing Mirror, where he wasn't present at all, and Kirby's Return to Dreamland, where he was a playable character. In that time, he has evolved constantly and has had many unique boss fights. And in this video, I thought it would be cool to rank them from worst to best. I will be making these judgments from a combination of the fight's difficulty, how interesting they are from a gameplay/narrative perspective, as well as my own general thoughts on the matter. Here's a few rules first, though, that I feel I need to explain. I will be covering every game, both mainline and side games. Any Dedede encounters and sub games won't really be discussed because I've always genuinely considered them more mini games as opposed to full games on their own right. This Kirby Superstar is a special case, and I will get to that. Also, most Kirby games have a New Game Plus with changed difficulty and boss tactics, and in some cases, even different designs. And just to be consistent, I will be, for the most part, including them alongside the quote-unquote original fights in my ranking, unless they're unique enough to warrant their own ranking, but really, it'll depend on a case-by-case basis. Before I start with the ranking list, I figure I ought to talk about an honorable mention, which goes to HRD3. This ancient war machine fought in Kirby's Return to Dreamland in the Extra mode, in addition to being a highly enjoyable boss fight that actually displays battle damage while you fight him. It was actually a repurposed, unused concept from the cancelled Kirby GameCube title. In said unreleased GameCube game, there was a large mech with the same design that would be utilized for HRD3, except it had a far more Dedede-like paint job. However, despite how cool this boss is, it isn't really a Dedede boss in my opinion, as it was repurposed for usage outside of the Dedede context, and as such, it won't be included in this list. I will say if I was to hypothetically include it, it would rank relatively high. It wouldn't be in the top 10, but I still think it would be really good. But I think that this is enough build-up, and without any further delay, let us begin this list with the worst Dedede boss fight. Kirby's Avalanche, infamously known as a simple reworking of Puyo Puyo in the same basic vein as Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine by Sega. And while it is true that it is just a reworking, I still like the game. I don't have an issue with Puyo Puyo, unlike some other people, and even if it's not my favorite type of puzzle game, it's still relatively decent. In the game, King Dedede serves as the final challenger to Kirby in the first annual Dreamland Avalanche competition. As such, he's got the same basic gameplay as the other encounters, except that when one of his Puyos lands on his half of the screen, it mildly shakes. This really doesn't have much effect on gameplay, and it's really just taken full cloth from the original Puyo boss, Zo Daimo. Oh yes, and the computer cheats. I mean, seriously, there have been instances where it rotates the Puyo even though it clearly touched the ground. Honestly, it's probably the most forgettable DDD boss fight in the entire series. I mean, seriously, you could replace him with anyone else that was fought, and the boss would be basically the same. This combined with what has to be the most forgettable music DDD ever had, and unfortunately, this guy gets the displeasure of being the worst DDD quote fight in the series. But hey, as negative as it is, we're only going up from here, so let us continue. Kirby Star Stacker for the Game Boy is another puzzle game, but one which has a far more interesting gameplay loop, having to line up Kirby's animal friends with stars between them. So already, at a basic level, this boss fight of Dedede was more engaging in terms of gameplay than the previous one. You confront Dedede in the round to clear mode, and it's pretty easy except for at the highest difficulty. Unlike the last entry, the computer doesn't cheat. Also, Dedede's expressions in this game change in a manner that is far more satisfactory than the static picture of King Dedede in Kirby's Avalanche. Starting with a smug grin that becomes a massive grin when it looks like he's winning. And when it looks like he's about to lose, he honestly looks like he's having a freaking orgasm, and that's just freaking hilarious. Honestly, it's not really that much of a step up, but these little improvements in general make him slightly better than the Kirby Avalanche boss fight. Dedede's boss fight in Kirby's Superstar Stacker is essentially the same as that in Kirby's Star Stacker, which makes sense as it is a remake released for the Super Famicom after all. And as to be expected in a remake, the game has greatly improved graphics that seem like a mix between that of Kirby's Superstar and Kirby's Dreamland 3. It's really fluid and just achieves what the Game Boy with its green screen simply could not. Also, instead of a mildly off-putting face of King Dedede, we actually see him and Kirby slug it out in a rather humorous, cutesy way. The animation is extremely smooth and gives off the sort of childish and petty aura of the early game's rivalry between King Dedede and Kirby. In this game, Dedede decides to be a prick and shoot down Mr. Star with a cannon that shatters the poor entity into pieces. Kirby meets one of these pieces and helps get the other pieces, and sends the king flying into the stratosphere, which honestly seems fair for his attempted homicide. But really, the reason anyone really remembers this game, which was never released outside of Japan by the way, is the theme of this boss fight. Yes, this remix of Dedede's theme is not only an amazing and high-energy track, worthy of respect from its own right, it also is being used in this video and served as the basis for what would become known as the Masked Dedede theme. For that fact alone, it deserves recognition, and it is because of these features that it is ranked where it is. Sure, it's not exactly the most complex fight, and all subsequent boss fights, in my opinion, are more thrilling, but the music and graphics put this a step ahead of the other two, in all honesty. Kirby's Block Ball is what happens if you take the breakout game concept to the next level with new gameplay and actual story and bosses. It is honestly probably one of the best games with this style of gameplay, and much like most early Kirby games, the final boss isn't some Eldritch abomination, but is King Dedede, who is up to no good. In this game's plot, King Dedede steals the 5 sparkling stars and hides them inside his castle's foundation. Why, you ask? Because he's the bad guy, of course. Honestly, this is probably the most Bowser Dedede ever was. In the end, Kirby defeats the king, and the sparkling stars destroy his castle and reveal a fountain. Probably wasn't a smart idea to build your foundation out of something so fragile, DDD. I mean, seriously. In terms of the boss fight itself, it is definitely the hardest fight in the game. You gotta use these bars to bounce Kirby into the king breakout style. Oddly, the side ones have these blocks that give an extra insurance. The bottom ones have spikes, and if you hit them, you lose a life. And King Dedede has 3 phases. The first phase is relatively easy in that he just jumps every so often and tosses a bomb to temporarily paralyze one of the bumpers. After taking sufficient damage, the king enters into his second form, in which he starts floating and can only be attacked from the back. He'll inhale Kirby and spit him out if he hits him in the front. The third phase is the strangest. King Dedede pulls out a bazooka and begins blasting them in all 4 directions and moves a lot faster. These rockets not only can stun the bumpers, but can also shrink them, meaning it's hard to hit Kirby with them. Plus, he moves a lot. Overall, quite an energetic, frenetic encounter that is the pinnacle of breakout style boss fights. Plus, the music in the fight is pretty darn good. Kirby's Pinball Land, much like Kirby's Block Ball, is based on a pre-existent game. This time it's pinball, obviously. Arguably, it's more influential, if only because a lot of games have since implemented boss fights in pinball, in contrast to Breakout, which to this day remains mostly the same, with most future releases still lacking boss fights. Sadly, this improvement does not extend to the story, as in the game, Dedede just randomly jumps on top of Kirby for no reason at all. He then magically summons a pair of pinball bumpers and uses them to jump into the air to escape retribution from his petty physical assault. In terms of the boss fight, it is actually rather similar to that of Kirby's Block Ball. The first phase sees him underneath a spotlight that fits within his egotism. He starts tossing bombs occasionally, which stun the bumpers for a brief time. Luckily, he stands still so that it is relatively easy to hit him. In the second phase, he starts floating around, though it is easier as you can still hit him wherever and doesn't do what the previous boss fight did. The third phase is where things get interesting. Here, King Dedede, for the first and only time in the series, begins utilizing lightning attacks that he releases from his hands, Emperor Palpatine style, that stun the bumpers. He also jumps around a lot. It's honestly a rather enjoyable boss fight with some very energetic music that really fits the game. Kirby Tilt and Tumble was a puzzle game released for the Game Boy Color. It is a rather cool concept for a game that utilized a literal motion sensing device to move Kirby by tilting the person's Game Boy. This interesting gameplay is fun, though it sadly did have a slightly negative impact on the game's bosses. Most of them are these extremely easy, generic Eye of Sauron wannabes, the orb observers in rainbows of recolors. And Krakow is just kinda there, in all honesty. Dedede's fight, which is the final boss, is the only one that is actually enjoyably challenging, and in all honesty is probably the best part of the game. King Dedede appears and grabs a star. Now invincible, he starts walking backwards and forwards, flashing. He will charge at Kirby occasionally. Once at half health, he begins throwing hammers as a sort of boomerang attack. Honestly, his attacks are faster than you'd expect, and so he can catch you off guard the first time playing. To damage him, one must hit him in the back after he charges, which causes him to drop the star and leaves him vulnerable. Then you launch Kirby at him several times, causing Dedede to burst into tears. Of course, Kirby being Kirby, comforts the king, and the two walk off, with the king tripping. As for the story, there barely is anything here. Kirby wakes up from a nap and see King Dedede and Waddle Dee walking with bumpers, and he has seemingly stole all the stars again. I gotta question how that works. I mean, honestly, if I was ranking this list on story, this would probably be ranked bottom in all honesty, because the story is just really bad. Though I will admit the music is absolutely amazing. Kirby's Dream Course is a pretty great golf game, and much like a lot of these insert Kirby into a previous genre takes, it really gets the golf formula to the next level with all these abilities and how, in a rather puzzle like manner, you have to defeat enemies in a certain route and unlock the hole. It even has a boss fight. Yes, you heard that right. A boss fight in a golf game, which is just so interesting. And it is Dedede in his mech called Robo DDD. In terms of appearance, it is a clockwork mech that has the proportions of Dedede, albeit with a drill in place of one hand and a giant clamp in place of the other. In terms of fight, it slowly approaches Kirby, and if it reaches the green zone, it's an instant game over. He also spawns the very annoying Chibi Dededes. Yes, that's really their names. They're actually called Chibi Dededes, and which will try to run up behind Kirby and belly slide into him, causing him to lose a life. In terms of the fight itself, you gotta hit Dedede with Kirby several times before he explodes, which is honestly makes it one of the most simple DD boss fights of the entire series, but I can't help but praise just the concept of a golf boss fight. No one really does this, and honestly, I hope that changes at some point. In terms of plot, guess what? King Dedede is stealing Dreamland stars again. Man, they must be really valuable considering that he keeps doing it in such a tropic manner. Kirby Battle Royale was arguably the least well remembered Kirby spinoff, or at the very least, the one the least amount of people talk about. I honestly found it rather enjoyable, all things considered. However, the final boss is without question the most memorable part of the single player campaign. The Dedestroyer Z is another giant robot and arguably the closest thing to the lost boss of the cancelled Kirby GameCube game. Well, I will probably get with Dedede actually being involved. The fight takes place in a semi-circular arena in which there is a cannon on the stage. This is important as it is the only way Kirby can damage the mech, by knocking Kirby clones into him. In terms of attacks, Dedestroyer Z has several. First, it has a hammer attack in which it hones in on the player and slams down the mallet onto the platform, temporarily exposing the electrical wires underneath, creating what is essentially a pit. The second attack is a massive laser that can fire, which crosses the entire arena. It can be dodged relatively easily by jumping or crouching. A third attack is where he covers much of the arena in targeting icons before firing 8 missiles to detonate on those spots. However, most of the mech attacks rely on printed Kirbys. In terms of the plot, Dedede hosts a tournament and utilizes his newest invention, the Kirby printer, to humiliate the original Kirby. Sadly, this plan fails, and so Dedede uses the printer in the construction of this mech. When he's defeated, the printer explodes, sending Dedede flying, and all the Kirby copies become dissipated. Overall, it's not the hardest fight, but I do find it being very distinctive in terms of gameplay among King Dedede's fights, and the music is really energetic, fitting of the party game aesthetic. It's probably the best mech fight of all the mech fights that Dedede has participated in. Kirby's Squeak Squad is truly a Kirby game, perhaps the most Kirby game to exist. All joking aside, this was the second Kirby game I ever played, and as such, I did enjoy it, and I still have a soft spot for it. Though I have to admit, looking back, it is an extremely cookie cutter game, being rather generic, but I still consider it a good game as even the most basic Kirby game still leads to a generally good experience. And, that's just due to the inherent quality of the Kirby gameplay experience. As such, DDD's fight, which is the first in the mainline games we've gotten to and the first quote unquote standard DDD boss fight we've discussed, is arguably the most generic boss fight in this entire list. And it's nowhere near the top in terms of quality. In essence, this fight is identical to that seen in Kirby's Adventure all the way back on NES, except he has far less health and suffers far more recoil from damage, resulting in an extremely easy first boss fight. And that's saying a lot considering this series has Wispy Woods as a recurring boss. Honestly, the plot is the most pathetic showing of King Dedede in the entire series. I mean, seriously, he's just doing nothing wrong until Kirby shows up looking for Shortcake and beats the crud out of him before it's revealed the Squeak Squad are the ones who actually stole the cake. And Dedede afterwards disappears from the plot from that point on. Honestly, it's rather pathetic. The only thing of note is that it has a reference to the anime in the background, but even then, that's so superficial. Honestly, if it wasn't for the good backbone that this boss fight had, it'd probably be far lower, and it's definitely, even if it's not the worst boss fight, it's definitely the most forgettable of them all. Kirby's Dreamland, the first Kirby game and the one that started it all. Going back, while it set the series foundations and is still somewhat enjoyable, it does lack some of the finishings that later games would introduce, like copy abilities. DDD's boss fight here is similar in that it sets the basic foundations for what would eventually become the standard DDD boss fight, though it lacks some of the later additions that fully fleshed out the King's boss fights. The boss fight takes place in a wrestling style arena, which is seen in many future games. The king has a variety of attacks that include trying to pounce slash trip on Kirby, trying to hit Kirby with his hammer, or inhale him, to which he'll spit Kirby out again, causing damage. He also occasionally jumps into the air and tries to crush Kirby. He's also able to jump in the air and swing his hammer if Kirby is above him. Rather simple, but definitely with 10 hits, the hardest enemy in the entire game. Extra Mode, which was surprisingly enough introduced in this game, has his movement speed greatly increased and he jumps around a lot more and further. Honestly, while this lacks some of the future additions, he's actually somewhat more challenging than the previous boss fights I've discussed, and if it wasn't for him, all the others wouldn't exist. So simply, I cannot rank him any lower than the second lowest standard Dedede boss fight. But he has been slightly outshined by future games, which we shall discuss. In terms of the plot, it's pretty basic. He stole all the food in Dreamland, which, if you know Kirby, you just don't do that. It was pretty basic, not really an in-depth plot, but Kirby's never really been into those sorts of highly detailed plots, so it's not that bad either. Kirby's Adventure was the second game in the series and the first on a home console. It really solidified what a Kirby game is, adding many essential parts of the franchise that the first game lacked, including copy abilities, Meta Knight, and an Eldritch Abomination as a final boss, while not changing the basic gameplay that worked so well last time. In much the same way, so is the Dedede fight here handled. He has all the same basic traits as a Dreamland fight. You know, he can hammer, he can tackle, he can jump, but he has one new ability here, in that he can puff up and hover like Kirby can. Somehow he taught himself that after his original defeat. Arguably, it's the easiest attack of his to dodge, and the extra mode doesn't really make him harder, it just reduces Kirby's health points and doesn't offer any save states. It's honestly kind of a letdown, really. In terms of plot, it's a little more complex than the first game, in that this time the King Dedede is not really the bad guy, he's trying to stop Nightmare, so he broke up the Star Art into several pieces and gave them to his friends. However, Kirby is unaware of this, and instead of giving the king a chance to explain himself, he goes back and gathers all the Star Art pieces. Luckily, though, Kirby is able to destroy Nightmare, but still. Kirby's Nightmare in Dreamland was a full remake of the first game for the Game Boy Advance that saw upgraded graphics, new level design, minor changes, and some enemies replaced or redesigned. King Dedede's boss fight is virtually identical here, but has some amazing music and oddly feels slightly slower, though that might be an illusion caused by the smoother animation structured over the same basic gameplay programming. I've decided to include it in here because it's really not its own boss fight. It's essentially the same as Kirby's Adventure, which makes sense as this is a remake after all. Kirby Fighters 2. A greatly expanded version of the subgame Kirby Fighters from Kirby Triple Deluxe. In said game, we see the unexpected as both King Dedede and Meta Knight team up to defeat Kirby. There is actually some debate on whether this counts as a Dedede fight or a Meta Knight fight, but I consider it both and warrants being on this list. Also, technically the first battle at the end of the game's story mode's second chapter are actually Waddle Dees in disguise, but since they're basically the same fight, I will be treating it as such. Their attacks are all based on the two working together. The first attack is King Dedede running forward while Meta Knight flies above him and does a series of sword slashes. The next, referred to as Gordo Throw, sees the pair position themselves on opposite sides of the stage. King Dedede then bats 2 or 3 Gordos across the stage, with Meta Knight proceeding to knock them back across the stage. The next attack sees them position themselves at the corner of the stage. Once done, King Dedede slams the ground with his hammer and sends out a shockwave as Meta Knight throws out 4 sword swipes and a crescent shot. King Dedede also tries to inhale, and ooh boy does this attack suck, as Dedede will spit them out over to Meta Knight, who will then swipe Kirby once it hits him. With piggyback charge, King Dedede jumps on one side of the stage while Meta Knight swoops into position above him. Meta Knight then jumps on Dedede and starts spinning around and hyper rushing. There are several additional attacks in Chapter 3's encounter and onwards. In the first, Meta Knight strikes his sword into the ground, releasing a small gust of wind that moves towards the king, and when it hits him, it turns into a massive tornado as King Dedede rides in it, doing a hammer spin, moving around the stage. The second attack sees Meta Knight fly into the air and hold position until he throws out two crescent-like attacks diagonally downwards, while the king super jumps around. The third attack sees Meta Knight fly into the air, with the king taking to the side of the stage, as Meta Knight throws out sword blades, as King bats them at Kirby. A similar attack is done with boulders summoned by Meta Knight, with a duplicate where Meta Knight splits into 4 copies while King Dedede inhales them and spits them out as projectiles at Kirby. This final attack, alongside the previous one, are introduced in Chapter 4's encounter, as we see the King and Meta Knight grab hold of each other and spin around in the air, releasing several blade attacks before stomping into the ground. Yeah, this fight is really complex and combines aspects of both, but sadly I think there was a bit too much Meta Knight, and as such, it's ranked on this list. But I will say it's still an enjoyable fight that really challenges the player to be more resourceful and adaptive. But we're not quite done with this game yet, as there's one more boss fight that ranks slightly higher. Waning Crescent Masked Dedede and Waxing Crescent Masked Meta Knight have got to be the worst named bosses in the entire series, bar none. And if I went by that metric alone, they would probably rank last on this list. However, despite their extremely clunky name, they actually have some really cool designs, and their boss fight is pretty stellar. It also really highlights the friendship the two have built over this game's campaign that I wish more games would do so. Most of their attacks take the basic ones from the previous fight, but scale them up to a whole new level, like how Meta Knight splits into more copies and summons more boulders. They also move faster. Due to this, it has a slightly harder encounter, and because of this, I consider the boss fight a little bit better, though the name is still terrible. Kirby Canvas Curse was a Kirby spin-off game that prominently used the touchscreen to control Kirby, who has been turned into an orb of paint by the evil witch Drowica. In terms of the plot, Dedede was kidnapped and technically cloned, so this is technically not the real King Dedede, but yeah. I think that this is one of the games that uses Dedede the least well in terms of the story itself, though it is slightly better than Kirby Squeak Squad. Also, technically, the bosses are mini-games that are later repurposed as sub-games, with the exception of the final boss, but they're still called boss fights, and they start off as boss fights, and as such, I will be treating them as such. King Dedede's boss fight has Kirby racing him through a horizontal racing track as sort of a more extreme gourmet race. It's actually really fun to control, having to avoid obstacles and items that would slow him down while eating fruit to speed up while not getting so fast as to lose control. It's fun and simple, and eventually when you unlock it, it's a nice fun little sub-game to replay over and over again. Technically, you have to beat it like twice in order for full completion, but despite that, I still find it to be a fun boss fight that, while simple, is enjoyable to participate in. Kirby's Mass Attack is another DS Kirby spinoff that primarily used the touchscreen, and I think it is a step up in every regard to Canvas Curse in terms of actual gameplay. It has more fun gameplay, better music, and relevant here, much better bosses. In this game, King Dedede utilizes a massive hot air balloon with his face, showing off his massive ego, which in said balloon he'll toss bubble bombs down at Kirby. Those with yellow counters will count down much quicker than those with green counters. So you gotta bounce the bombs back at him using the Kirby's, which after taking an amount of damage in the balloon, the king will basically fall out, giving Kirby a chance to attack him. In the second phase, he tosses more bombs, and afterwards he then jumps and slams into the ground 3 times. He jumps back into the balloon, and suddenly Waddle Dees crash through the walls and begin chucking these annoying bombs at Kirby. After dealing with these guys and bouncing back 6 bombs, Dedede's balloon bursts and the king falls down and enters into his third and final phase. In this phase, the king tries to smash Kirby with his hammer. He can deflect Kirby with his hammer, and so you have to attack him from the back, which is actually a rather unique trait. I don't think we really see the king blocking attacks with his hammer in other games. We also see what is after this defeat, we encounter what is described as a zombie Dedede clone that has a purple color scheme and a much more pale undead color. It's essentially the same fight, except he has significantly less health and no Waddle Dees show up, which is why I'm combining him in with the main one, as he isn't really a different boss. It isn't like a masked Dedede situation where you fight him but he has a significant change. It's just a recolor that Necrotius made. In terms of the story, Dedede is just kind of there. I mean, he's living on the third Popopo Island, having recently built a rather tacky resort there on the beach. It's subtly implied that he's being controlled or at least influenced by the Skull Gang due to Dedede possessing a flame that prevents Kirby from reaching a certain area. But it's not explicitly said, but which is a refreshing change, as I am quite frankly sick of King Dedede being directly controlled by another entity. Zombie Dedede, though, is a clone made by Necrotia, so he is under that person's control. So, Overall, it's an interesting boss fight that really shakes the formula a little bit. Kirby Superstar was a great game released for the NES. It is a highly influential in the series as it was the first to give the copy ability these distinctive hats. It was divided into 6 smaller games, the first of which was Spring Breeze, a remake of the original Kirby's Dreamland, in which the king is the final boss, and is in essence identical to the fight there, but due to improved graphics, the arena just feels a lot more alive. The remake released for DS was very important for a reason I'll discuss later, but it took the thematic atmosphere to a whole new level, as we even get cameos of Mario characters like Mario and Yoshi. But like Nightmare and Dreamland, it doesn't really change anything and doesn't warrant its own separate ranking, and as such I've decided to include it here. Kirby's Blowout Blast was a standalone eShop game for the Nintendo 3DS that served as an upgraded version of the sub-game Kirby's 3D Rumble, seen in Planet Robobot. This experimentation likely inspired HAL to finally make a fully 3D Kirby game that we'll talk about later in this tier list, though There is no real story. The boss fights is still something. In the first form, he uses his hammer to try and hit Kirby. He can even try to inhale Kirby or jump on him. Honestly, it's rather basic, though it is in 3D, so it has a little more oomph to it. However, he gets a second form by using the power of one of the sparkling stars, to which he turns himself into a giant. In this form, he inhales much more violently, but mainly attacks with his huge mallet, which he tries to slam down on Kirby and generates shockwaves. In addition, there is a more powerful version called Dedede's Revenge, which aside from giving him a purple color scheme, he moves faster and attacks more aggressively, and instead of generating round shockwaves, he generates shockwaves that home in on Kirby, and he can turn around while inhaling. His giant form in Dedede's Revenge also gets a few more techniques, including attacking faster and generating bolts of electricity that follow Kirby around on the ground. Masked Dedede serves as the final boss for Kirby's Blowout Blast. After getting revived by a sparkling star, King Dedede dons a mask and uses powered up attacks from the regular giant Dedede, but adds more, such as a attack in which he fired a giant heat laser and shoots a bunch of missiles at him. His mask also serves as an additional gameplay purpose as it protects him from Kirby's Star Blasts, and he must use a bullet blasts instead. A nice fight that is slightly enjoyable, but is definitely the lowest of all the masked DDD fights, which is saying something since the others are quite amazing. King DMind, as an entity, appears to be this weird sort of fanfiction-esque fusion of Shadow Dedede from Kirby's Dreamland Deluxe and DarkMind that is summoned by Dark Tyranza. He is the King of Darkness, and design-wise, he looks pretty cool, but I must admit the color scheme of his revenge form looks a lot nicer with the sort of bluish glow. He appears as two identical boss fights in two different games. During the first phase, he can do body slams, fire projectiles from his hammer, and release projectiles from his stomach mouth. In his second phase, his hammer breaks and summons a halberd that creates explosions as his core body transmorgifies into a grotesque eye-like abomination that shoots lasers at people. His revenge fight is basically the same, but grants him the ability to spin around like a tornado. Honestly, DMind is a fun boss fight, but is hampered by Kirby's fighter's gameplay and attacky design. He just really, of all the boss fights I've talked about, he's just weird. It's hard to explain exactly what he is or my thoughts on him on the matter. He's just bizarre, honestly. Now, King Dedede, being a puppet to some more powerful evil entity, has become somewhat of a recurring trend in the Kirby franchise, and no fight better highlights this than the one in Epic Yarn, in which the evil Yin Yarn, using a literal living evil marionette, controls him like a puppet. In terms of story, there is a funny cutscene where he's being tied up by imposter Waddle Dees that Yin Yarn had slowly replaced his own Waddle Dees with. The king attacks in the same basic way with his hammer, and you gotta credit them. The yarn stars generate are really kind of cool in that they bounce around, sort of like a bunch of rubber. Anyway, you gotta grab these stars and chuck them back at DDD, which causes him to basically get knocked out for a time, and from there you jump on his back and you have to do a ground pound. From there, you get a chance to rip off one of the four strings controlling King Dedede. After you do that four times, the marionette basically dies, and King Dedede is freed from his influence. Honestly, it's not a hard boss fight, but it has some really good music, and I do like Kirby's Epic Yarns yarn-based aesthetics. It's really neat. Oh boy, this will no doubt be my most controversial listing of them all. Kirby and the Forgotten Land is the most recent mainline Kirby game out, as of the time of recording this video, and it has been justifiably praised for its revolutionary changes it did to the series, and its excellent transition to 3D, which is something that quite a few series really struggle with. King Dedede, of course, was part of the game, and while we'll get to his main fight much later on, the Masked Dedede fight, the Forgo Dedede boss fight, is not my favorite. The boss fight opens to the king struggling to resist a boar mask and begins attacking Kirby with Wild Pound, in which he slams his hammer while chasing after Kirby. With Wild Stomp, he slams the ground so hard it causes pillars of flames that weakly home in on Kirby. With Wild Tornado, Dedede spins in the air like a tornado and tries to hit Kirby 3 times before becoming dizzy. With Wild Dedede Jump, he makes 3 big shockwave generating leaps. With Wild Hammer Throw, he tosses hammers that burst into a pool of lava at Kirby. In his second form, Dedede goes deranged and feral and begins running on all fours like a boar. He will run at Kirby, summon enemies, and fire tornadoes. He's actually rather annoying, and the reason I rank him so low is because he really doesn't seem like a Dedede fight. It's too erratic, and the character just doesn't seem right. And there are times where I clearly dodged an attack but still got hit, which is just annoying as heck. There is a stronger version of him where his attacks are faster, but it's really more of the same, and I don't like the weird colors. I mean, they look like one of those off-brand rave bars. Just weird. I don't like this boss fight. It's really good, but it just doesn't go into the top 10, honestly. But now we're in the top 10, and things are only going to get better from here. With Kirby 64 and the Crystal Shards, we see the first Kirby game to use 3D graphics, and the only Kirby game on the console, in fact. In this game's first world, each level, interestingly enough, ends with a boss. Some consider them mini-bosses, but there are actual mini-bosses in the game that are just scaled-up versions of regular enemies, and Dedede is not counted among them. In this game, King Dedede gets possessed by one of the evil dark matters after being a dick for a bit, taking a crystal shard from Kirby. Frankly, he kind of deserves it, and in the end, he is turned into a slave of the dark matter entity. It is a rather easy boss fight with low health. In his first phase, he'll attack Kirby with his hammer, which explodes when it smashes on the ground. In his second phase, he begins floating and his stomach opens into a grotesque dark matter eye that shoots out orbs or begins biting at Kirby. Honestly, if it wasn't for his rather low health, I do think the boss fight would be a little better. In fact, the next boss fight will just do that. But really, even without the high health, it honestly is a pretty fun boss that I enjoy encountering, but is sadly too easier to be any higher than the lowest of the top 10. Kirby's Dreamland 3 was the second in a trio of games that were mainly owned by Shinichi Shimomura, a man who not only had a distinctive game design aesthetic, also disappeared into the Phantom Zone and has never been seen since. In terms of plot, the king, alongside several other entities from around Popstar, are possessed by dark matter. Once again, Dedede has two faces. The first takes place on the ground, where we see him doing all the standard attacks, trying to tackle Kirby, trying to smash Kirby with his hammer, and trying to suck him up. Honestly, it's pretty basic. In his second form, he begins floating in the air and is capable of many gruesome attacks using his stomach opening up like a mouth, and he tries to eat Kirby or shoots black orbs at him. If this sounds familiar, then yeah, it's essentially the same fight as the one in Kirby 64, but two things make it better. Firstly, I just think the graphics look better. I really appreciate the sort of crayon aesthetic the game goes for. It also is slightly faster and has a truly appropriate health bar, meaning it edges out that one slightly, even if in many ways they're basically the same boss fight. Kirby's Dreamland 2 introduced many aspects to the Kirby series, including the concept of animal friends and the amazing dark matter swordsman. In this game, Dedede is possessed by dark matter for the first time in the series, so it hadn't become a real trope yet. As possessed, Dedede has not been seen up to that point. The boss fight itself is really similar to that in Kirby's Dreamland and Kirby's Adventure, but has a rather interesting set of gimmicks. You see, the king shifts between two states. The first is a drowsy, hypnotized one, which sees him moving slowly, and has a really laissez-faire, basic expression. But usually, after losing half of his health, he reverts into a rage mode, in which he goes full crackhead and makes very fast attacks, can start throwing hammers, spit fireballs, and all his attacks have an explosive residue that makes it very hard to dodge. This boss fight is amazing at keeping ones on their toes, and because of that, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Kirby's Fighter Deluxe was a standalone version of the sub-game Kirby's Fighter from Kirby's Triple Deluxe. In that game, which was a greatly modified Smash Brothers, it had a very interesting final boss, referred to as Team DDD, which is composed of King Dedede and, depending on the difficulty, 23 to 63 smaller replicas of him in two different categories. The first category are mini Dededes, which are small pinkish red clones of King Dedede that are around half the size of King Dedede and can be easily defeated by an attack from pretty much any copy ability, but can easily mob Kirby as they appear in large groups. The second category are known as the combo DDDs, which are larger, orange-colored, with wooden hammers, and are overall much tougher, and can actually put up a decent amount of problems. King Dedede himself shows up in the final part of the boss, in which he bears a hammer that looks like the Star Rod for some reason. He can double in size, and once all his teammates are defeated, he gets a new destructive attack, like spinning around with his hammer, which launches keychains into the screen, obscuring the player's view. He's pretty fast as well. Overall, I really like the fight concept, as it reminds me of the wireframes from Super Smash Bros. Melee, and just has a great encounter overall, with a lot more character than the stuff from Super Smash Bros. Kirby Planet Robobot was very well received thanks to its unique, highly mechanized aesthetics as well as new gameplay. In this game, there are numerous reimaginings of classic bosses, and King Dedede is no exception, as Susie gathers some of his DNA after basically burying him in a pile of rubble and creates a clone out of a weird purple liquid. He has a lot of the same basic attacks as Dedede, including inhaling, hovering, super Dedede jump, hammer slam, and sliding at Kirby. After getting down to half health, he splits into three smaller clones that utilize their numbers to attack in new ways. With Hammer Farmer, they swing their hammer in unison, like how a farmer does with his sickle, and on the final swing, they release a shockwave. After they are defeated, it is not over, as we see the clones man a mech referred to as D3, which is a three-dimensional cannon of immense power with numerous devastating attacks. First, it moves around a path on the ground, which hurts Kirby on contact. With Dead Beam Blast, the cannon fires a barrage of energy blasts in a series that slowly sweeps across the arena and must be dodged by jumping. With Danger Cannon, the mech charges up and fires a giant laser cannon that spans the screen and leaves 3 stars on the ground. With a Disaster Flame, the mech shoots out 3 flames that leave fire on the ground. The mech can annoyingly move while attacking, which is frankly frustrating. With Dynamic Bomber, the mech shoots out a giant bomb that Kirby must destroy before it explodes. In every odd number attack pattern, it shoots out a single bomb, while every even number times it shoots out 3 bombs. If you hit it hard enough, it will bounce back and hit D3. With Destruction Ray, the mech springs up and fires an even larger laser. Much like the other bosses in this game, there exists a much harder variant referred to as a 2.0 version, the New Game Plus, which you play as Meta Knight. Dedede Clone 2.0 gains a pale golden coloration and has faster speed and several new exclusive attacks. This includes Hammer Shot, in which Dedede Clone creates 2 energy orbs and shoots them at Kirby or Meta Knight. With Shining Hammer, Dedede Clone can rain energy orbs over the stage, and with Hammer Slam, Dedede Clone can summon a large hammer that swings into the ground. Phase 2 with the clones also gets an additional attack in which the clones slide on the ground in a line covering much of the stage. Honestly, a pretty easy attack to dodge, but still enjoyable. Likewise, their cannon D3 gets a 2.0 upgrade of its own. Looking vaguely like a Pokemon ball, it doesn't actually get new attacks, but rather modifies them. All the laser attacks are much faster and can move around. And instead of summoning 1 bomb, it's always 2 or more. Overall, this fight is a cool one that takes the concepts in Team Dedede and refines them into a much more unique, developed boss fight. Kirby Star Allies is a controversial game due to its simplification of elements seen in the previous mainline series. But despite this, I actually liked most of the bosses, even if there's a little too much reusing. But the King Dedede fight, golly, it was great. The first phase, while a bit basic, it has a great theme, but when he gets into the second phase, oh my goodness, it gets gnarly. You see, in this game, Dedede is again possessed by a dark power, a piece of the Jamba heart, which overwhelms the king, causing him to steal a bunch of food and gorge on what is basically rotten crud. And in his second form, he is able to go buff. With these anchor arms, he can slam the ground, toss piles of rotten food, break the floor, and spin around columns. Not only is this a fun fight, a fair challenge, it is also a rather unique fight and is a reference to the anime, specifically episode 95, Frog Wild, in which a demon frog possesses Kirby and later the king. Quite a good episode, but considering I've only worked up to 43 at the time of recording this video, I won't be able to get to it for a little bit while. Oh yeah, and there's also Parallel Dedede. I almost completely forgot this guy, but I added him in the last minute. Honestly, aside from a more purple or black color scheme, it's basically identical to Macho Dedede. And it's just the same fight, except occasionally he'll throw, like, Gordos instead of piles of rotten food. He really doesn't warrant his own entry, but if I was to say give him one, it would be number 5, and he would rank just slightly above the baseline Dedede fight in Star Allies, simply because it's slightly harder. But really, it doesn't warrant its own tier. Kirby's Triple Deluxe was an amazing 3DS game that highly emphasized the 3D of the system in a way that other games really didn't. In terms of Dedede, it was the second game to have Mask Dedede appear and established it as a regular thing that would serve as the boss for several subsequent boss fights that we've already discussed. The first phase sees Dedede using his mechanical hammer that can shoot out a large gout of flames or a trio of missiles. Also, all his standard hammer attacks create a shockwave. Following his first phase being beaten, his hammer is destroyed and his mask partially damaged. But we see Taranza using his dark magic to revive Dedede, turning his robes purple and making him go deranged even more so. In his second phase, he grabs a massive axe off the column and begins attacking far more quickly. With Axe Tornado, he can spin around in a tornado. With Axe Shot, he creates 2 orbs of energy and swats them at Kirby. With Flying Axe, he spins even faster and flies into the air, surrounded by dark energy. With Axe Dance, he begins wildly swinging his axe about towards Kirby. With Axe Bomber, Dedede jumps into the air with his axe and comes crashing down into a large explosion. The next 2 attacks are done with the aid of Taranza. With Taranza Ball, Taranza produces 7 energy orbs and throws them at Mask Dedede, who hits them at Kirby. With Super Taranza Ball, he summons 1 large orb in place of 7 smaller ones. Speaking of Taranza, he actually plays a part in the plot of this game. You see, he kidnapped Dedede thinking he was the great warrior destined to destroy his love, though it was really Kirby. And frankly, I actually find this very interesting, where the quote-unquote damsel in distress of a game ends up turning into the sort of preeminent fight. That's a very interesting concept that I don't think really gets done a lot. He is also pretty much a puppet, though not nearly as prominent as in Kirby's Epic Yarn. And not only does this have just amazing music, it's a remix of the one from Kirby Superstar Ultra, but he also served as the basis for further boss fights that we've already talked about, like DMind, Team Dedede, and Dedede Clone, as well as the basis for the next boss fight that we're just about to talk about. Overall, he's amazing. Shadow Dedede is a clone of Dedede created by the Mirror World that Dedede himself fights in the New Game Plus of Kirby's Triple Deluxe. Now, in many ways, he is a clone of the previous fight, but is slightly faster and has more health, and has an attack called Belly Black Matter, in which he flies into the background and his stomach opens into a dark mouth that then spits out 8 dark orb blasts, and then repositions before shooting 3 more that bounce around and are much larger. While you may be wondering why I ranked it above the last one if it's so similar, or because one, I think the concept of a dark copy of Dedede is greatly interesting, especially since he wasn't in Kirby's Amazing Mirror and serves sort of to make up for that lack. His design also looks cool, heck, he even bleeds on his mouth attack, which is rather metal. I mean, you don't often see bleeding in Kirby. Also, he's just in general a much harder fight than the basic DDD, and due to this, I consider it just slightly above the Masked DD fight. However, he is not the pinnacle of Masked DDD fights. And the remake of Kirby Superstar, released for the DS, Kirby Superstar Ultra, it had a new game added that, much akin to Spring Breeze, which was a remake of Kirby's Dreamland, The Revenge of the King was a remake of the original game's extra mode. This game saw the addition as the final boss of Masked DDD. Story-wise, this time DDD wasn't under anyone's control, which is a nice change of pace. And indeed, the first time he has decided to take initiative since Kirby's adventure. He even offers a hammer like that of Meta Knight before the battle, though unlike Meta Knight, he won't wait around for you to pick it up, so you better grab it if you really want it. His attacks include a head dive in which he runs and dives at Kirby. With Inhale, he tries to inhale Kirby, and with Hammer, he tries to strike Kirby with his hammer. With Super Jump, he leaps into the air 3 times, and with his new hammer, he can do a bunch of stuff, including Jet Hammer Spin, in which he rotates rapidly along the ground. With Missile Launcher, he unleashes a barrage of missiles, 3 in fact, and with Flamethrower, his hammer shoots flames at Kirby. Now, all this might sound a little basic compared to the previous Masked DDD fights I've discussed, and while that is true thanks to the advancements in later games, I would say it has a distinctive feeling thanks to the electric cage that surrounds the arena. This, more than any other fight, truly challenges Kirby's floating ability, which honestly has been kind of harming every DDD fight we've talked about up to this point. Plus, the music is just hard-stopping amazing. And for a long time, this was my favorite boss fight in the entire series, as it really highlighted the apex of the rivalry between King Dedede and Kirby. He's not here to steal your food this time, he's here to kill you! But sadly, this has recently been usurped by the latest mainline game. Serving as the boss for the 4th level Winter Horns of Kirby and the Forgotten Land, King Dedede in this game not only is the first challenging boss fight in the game, but serves as a turning point in both tone and story, as every other boss fight after him is legitimately kind of scary, and even after beating him, the king manages to snag Elfin while Kirby is not paying attention. The king is now far more realistic in garb of modeled fur that honestly looks like something out of God of War 4 or Skyrim rather than Kirby. He has put on a little weight though. It looks a little bit more like his Kirby Dreamland 3, which I'll admit isn't my favorite aesthetic, but still, it makes sense given he's supposed to look more bestial in this game. He is accompanied by two primal Awoofies that charge at Kirby at the start of the boss, and has a lot of neat attacks that really transitioned the king well into 3D. With Hammer, he approaches Kirby and tries to bash him. With Super Dedede Jump, the king makes three giant leaps into the air, which produce shockwaves, and the last of which is a spinning one that has a much larger shockwave. With Head Slide, he runs after Kirby and dives at him. He will also do circular swipes of the hammer. Once half of his health is gone, he leaps into the background and grabs a pillar, which he begins swinging at Kirby. And with his end of the Ice Age attack, he slams the pillar onto the ground, creating a fissure that summons a massive ice spikes. On top of all that, he has a hard rock heavy metal remix of the Dedede theme that just sounds amazing. It's like something you'd hear from a heavy metal band. I mean, seriously, just listen to it. I put it in the beginning of this part, but I'm just going to play a clip of it again because it is astoundingly hard. Much like the other bosses, he also has a stronger Phantom variant that you fight after beating the final boss. And Phantom King Dedede, while I don't like the color scheme, is still the best of the lot. Firstly, he has a completely new attack, including Gordo Knock, in which he throws three Gordos at Kirby with his hammer. In addition, he is accompanied by six primal Awoofies instead of two. He's also much faster in his attack, like his head slide and using his hammer. Gordos that are lodged in the ground will also produce shockwaves if they are present when he does his super jumps. After losing half of his health, Phantom King Dedede will leap onto a high ledge and throw three Gordo bars at Kirby, which roll across the arena before he grabs a column and uses all the attacks from the original fight. Except this time, the Ice Age attack creates a permanent slippery ice floor. Overall, this boss fight is the pinnacle of Dedede fights in the entire series, and really is the Dark Souls of Dedede. Just amazing, and I hope future games build upon it. Really, I have never been this astounded by a boss fight in my entire life, especially in a Nintendo game. It's just astounding. Like honestly, it's just amazing. The aesthetics, the arena, everything. It's just amazing. Yeah, this was quite the long video to make. Took a lot of research, a lot of recording. I think I'm DDD'd out for the time being, and I want to thank you for joining me, and please consider subscribing for more Kirby-related videos, and please share this video out. All of my one-off videos have a history of not doing so well, or at the very least being controversial. Hopefully I didn't make the people on Tumblr blow up their minds simply for, making a video that wasn't to their liking. Merry Christmas and have a happy New Year. And be at home with your family. Trust me, it'll make you feel better. Peace out.